Welcome to British Accent Podcast. Welcome back to the British Accent Podcast, where we help you boost your English skills with practical tips and inspiring stories. I'm Emily, and today we're talking about something truly motivating. What can we learn from polyglots, the people who speak multiple languages fluently?
That's right. Polyglots often have unique strategies that help them learn languages faster and more effectively. Whether you are learning your second language or your fifth, their habits can teach us a lot about mastering English.
In this episode, we'll break down what makes polyglots so successful, the methods they use, and how you can apply those techniques to your own English learning journey.
If you've ever wondered how some people can learn multiple languages and make it look easy, this episode is for you. Let's get started.
Alright, let's dive right in. One of the biggest things polyglots do differently is their mindset. They don't see mistakes as failures. Instead, they see them as part of the learning process. They speak early, even when they're not perfect, and that helps them improve quickly.
That's such an important point. Many English learners hesitate to speak because they're afraid of making mistakes. But polyglots understand that fluency comes from practice, not perfection. So, if you're waiting to be ready before speaking, you might be holding yourself back.
Exactly. Another thing they do is immerse themselves in the language as much as possible. They don't just rely on textbooks. They listen to music, watch movies, read books, and even change the language settings on their devices. Basically, they make the language part of their daily life.
Right. And that brings us to another key technique: active learning. Instead of just passively absorbing content, polyglots actively engage with it. For example, instead of just watching a show in English, they might repeat phrases out loud, write down new words, or even shadow the dialogue.
That's a great tip. Another thing they do is focus on communication rather than grammar. Of course, grammar is important, but polyglots prioritize getting their message across rather than stressing about every little mistake.
That's something English learners can definitely apply. If you focus too much on being grammatically perfect, you might hesitate to speak at all. But if you focus on expressing yourself, you'll gain confidence much faster.
And speaking of confidence, many polyglots use a technique called language journaling. They write about their day, thoughts, or even practice dialogues in their target language. This helps reinforce vocabulary and improve sentence structure.
That's a brilliant exercise. Plus, it helps track progress over time. Even if you only write a few sentences a day, you will start noticing improvements in your writing and thinking in English.
Absolutely. And another thing polyglots do is make language learning fun. They don't treat it like a school subject. They make it part of their hobbies. If they love cooking, they watch recipe videos in English. If they love gaming, they play with English speakers. This keeps them engaged and motivated.
That's such a good point. If learning feels like a chore, it's easy to lose motivation. But if it's tied to something you love, it becomes a natural part of your life.
And another thing that stands out about polyglots is how they embrace challenges. Instead of avoiding difficult words or grammar, they tackle them head-on. They use new words in conversations, experiment with different sentence structures, and challenge themselves to think in the language.
Yeah, they see difficulty as a sign of progress. If something feels too easy, it probably means you're not pushing yourself enough. That's why so many polyglots actively seek out situations where they have to use the language, like joining language exchange meetups or talking to native speakers online.
Right, and they also make use of spaced repetition systems, SAS, for vocabulary learning. Instead of just memorizing words once and hoping they stick, they review them at strategic intervals. This helps move new words from short-term to long-term memory.
That's such a powerful tool. Apps like Anki or Memrise use this technique, but you can also do it manually by keeping a vocabulary notebook and reviewing words after a day, a week, and a month.
Absolutely. Another thing we can learn from polyglots is how they focus on pronunciation from the start. They mimic native speakers, practice intonation, and even record themselves to compare their speech with native audio.
That's a great strategy. A lot of English learners worry about sounding perfect, but it's more about being understood. I think imitating native speech patterns and practicing with real conversations helps more than just drilling phonetics in isolation.
Exactly. And speaking of real conversations, polyglots don't wait until they're fluent to start speaking. They dive in right away, even if their vocabulary is limited. They use simple sentences and build from there.
That's such a key point. The sooner you start speaking, the more comfortable you become with the language. And making mistakes early on actually helps you improve faster.
And another thing about polyglots is their ability to immerse themselves in the language daily, even if they're not in an English-speaking country. They surround themselves with English through music, podcasts, TV shows, and even changing their phone settings to English.
That's a fantastic way to make English a natural part of your life. And let's not forget the power of reading. Many polyglots read in their target language every day, whether it's books, articles, or even social media posts. It helps build vocabulary and reinforces grammar structures naturally.
Yes, and they don't just passively read. They actively engage with the material, they highlight new words, write summaries, or even discuss what they read with others. That extra effort helps solidify their understanding.
Speaking of engagement, another trick they use is storytelling. Instead of just memorizing random words, they create stories or personal connections with the vocabulary. It makes words more meaningful and easier to remember.
Oh, I love that strategy. When you attach an emotion or a personal memory to a word, it sticks in your brain much longer. That's why so many polyglots recommend journaling in English. It forces you to think in the language and express yourself naturally.
Exactly. It's also why they use shadowing, where they repeat sentences out loud while listening to native speakers. It helps with pronunciation, rhythm, and confidence in speaking.
That's a technique I've tried, and it really works. Plus, it helps reduce that fear of speaking because you get used to the sounds and flow of the language.
And fear is something that polyglots seem to overcome quickly. They don't worry too much about making mistakes, they just keep going, learning from every interaction.
Right, their mindset is all about progress, not perfection. And that's something every English learner can adopt too.
That mindset shift is huge. Instead of seeing mistakes as failures, polyglots see them as part of the process. They embrace trial and error because they know that's how real learning happens.
Exactly, and another thing I've noticed is that they don't just stick to one method. They experiment with different techniques until they find what works best for them. Some use apps, others prefer conversation partners, and some even use flashcards daily.
That flexibility is key. They adapt their learning to their lifestyle. If they don't have time for long study sessions, they break it into smaller chunks throughout the day. 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there, it all adds up.
Yes, and they always find ways to make English learning fun. Whether it's watching their favorite TV series in English, playing word games, or joining online language communities, they keep things interesting.
That's such a good point. If learning feels like a chore, you won't stick with it. But if you make it enjoyable, it becomes a natural part of your day.
And that's something everyone listening can take away. Find ways to make English learning enjoyable and sustainable. It's not about cramming for hours. It's about small, consistent efforts.
Absolutely. Small efforts led to big results over time. And who knows, maybe one day, our listeners will be the ones sharing their English learning success stories.
Yes, and speaking of consistency, another thing polyglots do really well is setting clear goals. They don't just say, I want to learn English. They set specific targets, like I want to hold a 5-minute conversation in English by the end of the month, or I want to watch a movie without subtitles in 3 months.
That's a game changer. Having clear, realistic goals makes progress measurable and keeps you motivated. It also helps you focus on what really matters instead of feeling overwhelmed by everything at once.
Exactly, and they track their progress too. Whether it's keeping a language journal, recording themselves speaking, or just checking off new words they've learned, they make sure they can see their improvement.
Yeah, because seeing progress, even small wins, boosts confidence. And confidence makes you want to keep going.
That's why mindset is such a huge part of language learning. If you believe you can improve, you will. If you tell yourself you're bad at English, you're going to struggle more.
Right. And that brings us to another thing we can learn from polyglots. They surround themselves with the language as much as possible. They change their phone settings to English, follow English-speaking content creators, and even think in English throughout the day.
Yes, thinking in English is a big one. Instead of translating everything in your head, try to describe what you're doing in English as you go about your day. Like, if you're making coffee, say to yourself, I'm pouring the water, I'm stirring the sugar. It helps train your brain to use English naturally.
That's such a good tip. It might feel strange at first, but over time, it becomes second nature. And the more exposure you have to English, the more natural it feels.
And speaking of exposure, another thing polyglots do differently is that they don't just rely on traditional learning methods. They mix things up. They use apps, read books, listen to podcasts like this one, watch movies, and even join language exchange groups.
Right. They make learning fun and relevant to their lives. If they love cooking, they watch cooking shows in English. If they're into gaming, they join English-speaking gaming communities. It's all about making English a natural part of their daily routine.
Yes, and they're not afraid to make mistakes. A lot of people hesitate to speak because they're worried about sounding silly or making errors. But polyglots see mistakes as part of the learning process.
Exactly. They embrace imperfection. They don't let fear hold them back. In fact, they often put themselves in situations where they have to speak, like joining group discussions or talking to native speakers.
That's such an important mindset shift. Every mistake is actually progress. If you're making mistakes, it means you're trying, and that's the only way to improve.
So true. And here's another thing. They focus on communication over perfection. Instead of worrying about getting every grammar rule right, they prioritize getting their message across. And that's the key to becoming fluent.
Yes, fluency isn't about speaking perfectly. It's about speaking confidently and making yourself understood.
And another big thing polyglots do is think in their target language as much as possible. Instead of translating everything in their head, they train themselves to associate words and ideas directly in English.
Right, and a great way to do that is by narrating your day in English. Just describe what you're doing in your head or out loud. I'm making coffee. I need to catch the bus. It's a beautiful day. Small things like this help you switch to thinking in English naturally.
That's a great tip. And I think another thing that sets polyglots apart is their patience. They know that language learning is a journey. They don't expect to be fluent overnight, and they celebrate small wins along the way.
Absolutely. They set realistic goals and focus on progress, not perfection. Maybe one day they learn 5 new words, and the next, they practice a short conversation. It all adds up over time.
And the best part, they enjoy the process. They don't see English learning as a chore, but as an exciting adventure. They find ways to make it fun, whether it's through music, movies, or meeting new people.
That's such an important mindset. If you love what you're doing, you'll stick with it and improve naturally.
And speaking of making English learning fun, another thing polyglots do is immerse themselves as much as possible. Even if they don't live in an English-speaking country, they create an environment where English is part of their daily life.
Yes, that could mean changing your phone's language to English, following English-speaking influencers, or even labeling objects around your house in English. The more exposure you have, the faster you absorb the language naturally.
Exactly. And they don't just passively consume content, they interact with it. They leave comments on YouTube videos, join discussions in English forums, or even talk to themselves in English.
That's such a powerful habit. I remember when I was learning Spanish, I used to record myself speaking, then listen back to notice mistakes. It really helped me improve.
That's a great idea. It's like giving yourself instant feedback. And that brings me to another point. Polyglots are not afraid to make mistakes. They embrace them as part of the learning process.
Right. Instead of feeling embarrassed, they see mistakes as proof that they're actually learning and pushing their limits. That mindset shift can make a huge difference.
And they actively look for feedback, whether it's from teachers, language partners, or even AI tools. They use corrections as a tool to get better, not as something to be ashamed of.
That's a key takeaway for anyone learning English. Don't be afraid to put yourself out there. The more you practice, the more comfortable you'll become.
Another thing we can learn from polyglots is that they don't rely on just one method. They mix different approaches: reading, listening, speaking, and writing to keep things fresh and engaging.
Yes, they might read books in English, but they also watch movies, listen to podcasts, and even use apps like Anki or Memrise to reinforce vocabulary. That variety keeps learning exciting and prevents boredom.
Absolutely. And they also understand the importance of repetition. They don't just learn a word once and hope it sticks. They see it multiple times in different contexts until it becomes natural to them.
That's such an important point. It's not just about cramming a long list of words, it's about seeing and using them in real-life situations. That's why reading and listening to natural conversations is so helpful.
And speaking of real-life situations, polyglots also make it a priority to connect with people who speak the language. Whether it's through language exchanges, online communities, or even social media, they surround themselves with English speakers.
That's a game changer. There are so many platforms now where you can find language partners. Apps like HelloTalk, Tandem, or even joining Facebook groups for English learners can help you practice with real people.
Exactly, and that helps with confidence too. The more you interact, the more natural English starts to feel. Have you ever done a language exchange yourself, Emily?
I have. I did one with a French speaker when I was learning French, and it was amazing. We would talk half the time in English and half the time in French, so we both got to practice. It really helped me improve my speaking skills.
That's awesome. And it just proves that learning a language isn't just about studying, it's about using it in real life. The more you engage, the faster you'll improve.
Right. And another thing I've noticed about polyglots is that they embrace making mistakes. They don't let the fear of being wrong stop them from speaking. They actually see mistakes as part of the learning process.
That's a great mindset. Too many English learners hesitate because they don't want to sound silly. But in reality, the fastest way to improve is by trying, failing, and learning from it.
Exactly. No one learns perfectly from the start. Even native speakers mess up sometimes. The key is to keep going and not let perfectionism slow you down.
And speaking of confidence, a lot of successful language learners use positive self-talk. Instead of saying, "I'm bad at English," they say, "I'm improving every day." That small mindset shift can make a huge difference.
Yes, motivation plays such a big role in learning. If you keep telling yourself you can't do it, your brain will believe it. But if you focus on progress instead of perfection, you'll keep moving forward.
That's why so many polyglots have a strong why behind their learning. They don't just learn English because they have to, they find a personal reason that keeps them excited, whether it's traveling, career opportunities, or making new friends.
That's a great tip for anyone listening. If you ever feel stuck, remind yourself why you started learning English in the first place. That motivation will help you push through any challenges.
And another thing polyglots do really well is surrounding themselves with the language. They don't just rely on traditional study methods. They change their entire environment to include the language they're learning.
Yes, that means watching TV shows in English, listening to podcasts, reading books, and even setting their phone or social media to English. It's about making English a part of their daily life, not just something they study for an hour a day.
Absolutely. And a lot of polyglots also use the shadowing technique, repeating words and phrases immediately after hearing them. It's a great way to train your pronunciation and speaking fluency.
That's a fantastic method. It forces your brain to think quickly in English. Plus, you get used to natural pronunciation and rhythm without overanalyzing grammar all the time.
Exactly. And speaking of grammar, another thing we can learn from successful language learners is that they don't obsess over perfect grammar in the beginning. They focus more on communication.
Right. They understand that grammar will improve naturally over time. The most important thing is to start speaking and using the language as much as possible.
That's a great takeaway. If you focus on fluency first, accuracy will follow. And the more you practice, the more confident you will become.
So, what can we learn from polyglots? Immerse yourself in English, practice daily, don't fear mistakes, and most importantly, enjoy the process.
Exactly. The key is consistency and making English a natural part of your life. Whether it's through listening, speaking, reading, or even teaching someone else, just keep engaging with the language.
And remember, every small step counts. You don't have to be perfect, just keep going, and improvement will come.
That's a great note to end on. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to follow our podcast for more tips on mastering English.
And let us know what's your favorite method for learning English. Send us a message or leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on the British Accent Podcast.
Bye.